everybody. Welcome to the Canada FASD Research Network's webinar. And today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about an overview of the FASD diagnostic guidelines and the processes that clinics undergo when they do diagnoses. And so we hope that you'll understand more about the process as well as sort of the criteria and the ways that a diagnosis of FASD is arrived upon. And so we really want to have families and service providers and hopefully researchers and policymakers and clinicians to really understand all of the elements and the complexity really that make up an FASD diagnosis and what the process entails. And we have two great speakers today, which I'll introduce. And I know some of you, but my name's Jocelyn Cook, and I have been in the field of FASD for a really long time. Over half of my life now, I guess maybe that's not a good thing, but nonetheless. And I started in this field just because I was during my PhD project in graduate school, and I found it really fascinating that there could be things that happened to maternal physiology and what was happening to a mom during pregnancy that affected fetal growth and development and affected the individual who was prenatally exposed for the rest of their life. And my PhD supervisor was kind of the grandmother of animal models of alcohol exposure. And I found it fascinating. And so in the meantime, I sort of went on and did some academic work and a lot of research and sort of switched from mice and placentas into some more population and epidemiology and sort of applied clinical work, and spent quite a few years in the policy field. And now, and with the Canada FASD Research Network, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada. And so working with women's healthcare providers all over the country from all different disciplines on all sorts of issues, one of which is alcohol use in pregnancy and other substances as well. And I also lead for CanFASD, the National Database Project. And so this is about 10 years in the running. And many of you probably are participants, and we're so thankful. And we gather data in a very standardized way about FASD diagnosis and folks who are coming in for assessments, all with the scope and the goal of understanding the diagnosis, understanding the strengths and challenges associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, so that we can help to provide models and predictions and link folks with interventions and supports and services. And so again, learning as much as we can about what works, what doesn't work, and how we can work together across disciplines and jurisdictions to be able to really make a difference and do meaningful work in the field. And so welcome to all of you. And I did, that Cook reference in the guidelines, that's actually me, and it took about 20 years off my life, but nonetheless, worked with many of you and came up with some diagnostic guidelines, and we revised those in 2015, and Dr. Rajani and Coleen are going to talk about that today. We know nothing's perfect, but we did the very best that we could. And again, many of you probably participated in that process. And so Coleen is going to talk to you first. She's a clinic training services coordinator for the Rajani Assessment and Diagnostic Clinic Training Services, and has been since 2011. I don't know how Dr. Rajani got a whole thing named after him, but that's impressive. Coleen's facilitated training and community practice, and she develops resources for FASD teams. I've worked with Coleen for years. It's always been really fantastic, and she's so committed. And so Coleen's going to talk to you now, and we'll do a few questions if there are in the chat with some time. We'll move on to Dr. Rajani. I'll introduce him later, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. So have at it, Coleen, and welcome to everybody who's here.
Hello, thanks for joining the webinar today. This disclaimer of no conflict and having no interest for any commercial interest of the material presented applies to both presenters today for the webinar. Today I'm going to be giving just a brief overview of the FASD assessment and diagnostic clinic process, starting with the referral and intake stage, going through to the debrief with client and family, as well as giving a bit of an overview of post-clinic interventions and describing 2 clinic model options, which are face-to-face or in-person, or virtual models for doing the assessment and diagnosis. Referral and intake is the first stage, and we always look at having a patient-first approach while maintaining the confidentiality throughout the process. It's always client-centered and supported throughout the referral and intake stage, and we always make sure that there's cultural sensitivity at all stages of the process. The clinic referral criteria applies both to referrals that meet the clinic criteria set and referrals that don't meet the clinic referral. First stage is having the referral form and consents. Once you've received them, the client file is active and work begins to prepare for the diagnostic clinic day. There's information to complete, and the assessments that have been done previously are requested and obtained and passed on to the clinicians doing the assessments. A complete information package is often given to the client and their caregiver or family. And often with older youth or adult clients, we do ask that there's a support or advocate just to be able to be informed of the schedule, the events before, during, and after the diagnostic clinic, including all the logistics of where the clinic's going to take place, the date and the times. A pre-clinic interview is often conducted with any adult referrals and their advocates. There are some referrals that don't meet clinic referral criteria. They could be a child is too young. And in that case, the client and family support or advocates and the referrer are also notified of the reasons why the referrals don't meet the clinic referral. Often a follow-up letter is sent, and we always want to make sure that there's alternate referrals and resources that are applicable and follow-up, particularly if the child's too young to come to clinic. We want to make sure that they're followed. Clinic coordinator is key, and often they're referred to as the wedding planner or the orchestrator of the clinic. And it's really essential for case management, for managing the referrals, as well as if there's any wait lists or wait times. They're responsible for ensuring that a lot of background information and history is collected, including family history, medical records, the prenatal alcohol exposure confirmation that relates to that client that's being referred. There's a lot of background information from education, child and family services agencies, justice, employment, and other reports. Any prior assessments completed by core clinicians, by psychologists, speech language, and occupational therapists should be requested. And we've had a lot of years of clinics doing FASD assessment and diagnosis now. So if there have been referrals for previous assessments, or if someone is returning for a reassessment due to deferral or a designation, that's important to note as well. This is a bit of a diagram that shows us the process that starts with referral and intake, including all of the information gathering, PAE confirmation, scheduling of assessments by the clinicians, including the physician or the nurse practitioner on the team who completes the physical and facial measurements and the neurological exam, going on to the multidisciplinary case conference, which involves all of the team members, where the diagnostic formulation and recommendations are carried through, and ending with the caregiver and client debrief. The consent forms are foundational for that intake process. We have to ensure that the consents are proper consents, that they followed the correct legislative authority that you're using to collect, use, and disclose the information, and that it recognizes the individual's right to know and understand why their personal and health information is being collected, who to contact for any questions, and also informing the individual before you collect their information. You're only able to disclose the information that's specified in the consent form that the legal guardian signs. Wait times and wait lists are common with many clinics, and generally a wait time starts when you've received an initial referral and ends with the final assessment and diagnosis process completed. And wait times can be dependent on a number of circumstances. Individuals or caregivers often want to know what it takes, what's the time frame, between the referral and actually when the clinic day happens. And for many clinics, they have to determine if prenatal alcohol exposure confirmation is required before the referral is received or accepted, or are they able to receive the referral when they realize that PAE may be suspected in that particular case. It can be dependent on how many referrals or cases can be accommodated by each clinic within a specified time frame. Some clinics have quotas due to their budget or their clinician availability, and there are sometimes demand for services that outweigh clinic capacity. The numbers of referrals received in the service region can be impacted or influenced by the level of community awareness, the referral criteria. Some clinics require that a medical practitioner, developmental pediatrician, be the one that the referral comes through as a bit of a pre-screen. Some clinics require a pre-assessment before accepting the referral, such as a psych-ed assessment. It's also could be dependent on the accessibility to services and the subsequent supports for referral in the intake process. There are also standards of practice for clinicians that may dictate the appropriate wait times for each client. The assessments is the next stage, having the assessments completed by registered psychologists, speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, and the team physician or nurse practitioner. Depending on the referrals, there may be copies of earlier assessments that have been completed, and these should always be forwarded to the respective clinicians that are doing the assessments. The coordinator organizes all of the assessment appointments with the client and clinicians, and this can be daunting in some cases where you're having the availability of the client, the capacity of the clinicians that are doing the assessments. And in each case, some of the clinicians do require their own consents prior to doing the assessments. It should be noted that when dealing with adult referrals, more contacts might be required to build rapport and to increase the likelihood of attending the assessments prior to the appointment day. And the key part of any clinic is certainly the diagnostic formulation and recommendations. This is where the multidisciplinary team meets to review case history, discuss the results of the assessment, and formulating the diagnosis and recommendations, and compiling the medical summary report. The next few slides go over the details of what's included in the final medical summary report that's always sent to the legal guardians in the case of a minor, and shared with the appropriate individuals that have been given permission to receive the report. Certainly the diagnoses are listed, FASD with or without sentinel facial features, or the designation, which is not a diagnosis, but is a designation in the guidelines for at-risk with neurodevelopmental disorder and FASD associated with PAE. We want to list the brain domains that are significantly impaired, as well as any other additional diagnoses which come to light from the assessments completed. These also include DSM diagnoses according to the criteria, as well as any other disorders, language disorders, mild to moderate intellectual disability, naming a few. Other significant findings are also important, even though they're not leading to the actual diagnosis. It's still really important to indicate whether there's other findings from behavioral issues, sleep issues, social skills, trauma, anger, and others that may not be on this list as well. We always have case-specific recommendations, and these are to make sure that the support agencies following FASD best practices for mentoring and supports. We look at school and education interventions, behavioral management, as well as speech language and OT interventions. Often SLP and OT interventions are accessed through the school, particularly if it's a younger child. We always have medical and health follow-up included in the medical summary report, which will recommend that there's connections with physicians, subspecialists for ongoing monitoring of other issues. And certainly if there's any pharmaceutical or medication issues, that's always included in the report. Mental health is so important, and we ensure that particularly for older youth and adults, that's a key component of the medical summary report, and make sure that there's recommendations on connections with the appropriate therapists. Respite social support is also a key recommendation. It can cover the details that are listed under that section, particularly when accessing respite supports, connecting with transition mentors, youth cultural mentors, and programming that might be available. Transitioning to adult services and young adult support is really important. And we do recommend that you indicate if there's any guardianship, legal representation, or trusteeship issues that should be acted on, particularly for that age group. Reassessment should be recommended, especially during key transition supports, and also when youth are transitioning to adult services and supports. Debrief with the client and family is the last process within the assessment and diagnostic process, and FASD as a medical diagnosis may not be easily understood by individuals and their caregivers. Therefore, the team should simplify the findings when presented so they're easily understood by everyone receiving the diagnosis. Assessment results and recommendations should be presented to the caregivers and, when appropriate, to the minor. Generally, the debrief with client and family is done with the physician or nurse practitioner of the team and with any other member that the team is predetermined. It's usually not with the whole team. It may be a bit overwhelming for the family and client. And the next slide does show how decisions are made and how the results are presented to adolescents. When disclosing and explaining the assessment and diagnosis result to a teen, there are different options that you can choose. The youth may participate in the case conference with the caregivers when given the diagnosis and outlining the recommendations. A team member may meet separately with the team to explain the diagnosis without the caregivers present. The caregiver could meet with the team first, then jointly with the clinicians, or the caregiver best determines the time to give the diagnosis at a later date. But this is always done in conjunction with the caregiver, legal guardian, and it can be dependent on the teen's maturity level, their level of understanding, and whether there's any emotional issues that may be present at the time. Debrief with the client and family is the last stage, and it does more than just giving the diagnosis and the recommendations. It's also an opportunity to educate about the impact of FASD and providing support for the patient and those involved with their care. It can allow the issues about any psychosocial issues that may be expected to develop as a result of receiving the diagnosis, particularly if the child is younger. Important that this information be communicated in a culturally sensitive manner using the appropriate language. And often there is a cultural knowledge broker or a cultural liaison that may be involved, especially if interpretive services may need to be provided. A member of the diagnostic team should follow up within a reasonable length of time to make sure recommendations have been addressed. And often there's a post-intervention worker that may be available on the as a secondary member of the team that can provide that support. And the team should also provide a customized list of feasible services that can be used post-clinic. And individuals and their caregivers should be linked to resources. Just because a service is limited or not available doesn't mean that an individual should be denied an assessment and management plan. Often we see in rural or remote communities that the diagnosis can be the instigator or lead to developing resources that clients need. For young adults transitioning to independent living situations, they should undergo a reassessment to identify any changes in their adaptive scores and make any subsequent adjustments to their management plan. I'm going to briefly just go over 2 clinic models to deliver the assessment diagnostic services. First is face-to-face or in-person, where all of the processes are done face-to-face. That includes meetings and interviews, including the physician caregiver and physician client interviews. Assessments by the clinicians are completed at specified location and times, and the multidisciplinary team meets, determines the diagnosis and the recommendations, and also the debrief with the client and caregiver, which delivers the diagnosis and recommendations by the physician and other members, are also done face-to-face. The other model, particularly since COVID, but also clinics are realizing that it can be an efficient model, is using a virtual model to deliver of the assessment and diagnostic clinic. Clinics can realize efficiencies when using a virtual model, especially in rural remote regions. They found that accessing services can be done in a timely manner, possibly lessening wait times, and it enables families to attend appointments, reducing long trips if they're rural, and having to attend multiple appointments. There's also greater comfort in assessment settings in the client's home communities. Often the child can be assessed in their school or other confidential locations without having to have missed time for the caregivers for work and the child from school as well. And it also allows for participation of caregivers and community supports who may not otherwise be able to attend. There's also a combination of face-to-face and virtual, which can, depending on how clinics work, you can use a hybrid model where perhaps some interviews are done using telehealth or telemedicine, or another virtual platform, or the team can meet virtually, and sometimes the assessments can be done face-to-face. So there are hybrid models where you can take components of each. Just in summary, we want to recognize that each clinic's unique. They deliver services that are client-centered, responsive to community needs, and as a result of ongoing training and mentorship, we're hopeful that there'll be increased consistencies in the FASD clinic services, and the processes that I've described, from receiving a referral through to the debrief with caregivers, they should be common with all clinics, and really shouldn't make a difference whether they're using virtual or face-to-face. There are commonalities to all clinics.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you, Coleen. And Colleen's going to come back. She's going to go have a snack, and then she's going to come back and join us for the panel discussion. And I just looked at all of you folks who are here. So hi, everybody. I kind of am sad not seeing people's faces, sadly, because I'm in my basement so long. But it's nice to see so many familiar names at the very least. And so hi again to everybody. So now I'm super excited to introduce my friend, Dr. Hasu Rajani, who has run some marathons and climbed some mountains. And he's really inspirational for all kinds of reasons. And he's been the team physician for the Lakeland Center for FASD since 2000. Wow, since 2000. And as well for Northwest Central, Northeast Alberta's FASD networks and clinics and other organizations. He's provides training and mentorship and expertise. He talks to all kinds of government folks about the importance of diagnosis and FASD. And he's a professor in the Department of Pediatrics. So he teaches residents. Hi, residents. Some of them are here today. So welcome. Always good to bring new brains into the field. And he's the interim director of the Division of Pediatrics in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta, and the interim zone clinical chief of community pediatrics in the Edmonton zone and Alberta Health Services. And always a pleasure to listen to Dr. Rajani's very lyrical voice. And I'm just excited to be here to hear what's happening. So thanks, Dr. Rajani, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you, Coleen, for setting the introduction to my talk, which is going to be more about the specific diagnostic process. So, okay, so I'm just going to start off. I'm going to cover the essentials of the Canadian guideline for FASD diagnosis. And my objectives include looking at the essentials of the guideline for FASD assessment and diagnosis, recognize the role of the clinicians and other team members, and also recognize the diagnostic criteria and terminology. I'll briefly touch on diagnosis in preschoolers because that's very topical currently. I'll also bring up the prenatal and postnatal factors and just some caution points in FASD diagnosis. There is a lot to cover, but so a lot of it will be touching on things and certainly can provide more details in discussion. So just to indicate that alcohol use during pregnancy has lifelong effects and is quite expensive, has a cost to society. The essential component of the diagnosis is having a multidisciplinary team. It's important that this team provides a comprehensive diagnosis and treatment recommendations. And obviously this team may vary. We have quite a few FASD diagnostic teams, and the core team members vary quite a bit depending on who's available and the context of the client that's being assessed. And obviously these team members should have the expertise to conduct a comprehensive functional assessment. I have listed the clinic coordinator in this core team membership, and the reason is, as Coleen already alluded to, the significant role they play in collecting information and processing all the information before the clinic diagnostic process takes place. And you can see that we would need a clinician who has expertise in FASD and differential diagnosis. So a physician or a nurse practitioner. Some of these physicians may be subspecialists like a psychiatrist or a geneticist. There may be a family physician who may do that. So somebody who's well versed and is knowledgeable. And almost all teams will have a speech language pathologist and a psychologist. An occupational therapist would depend on the availability of that individual within the region. Sometimes on adult teams, the psychologists can do a lot of the language assessments and may not have a speech language pathologist. Additional team members play a crucial role and do have important role in supporting the client subsequently and also providing input in the recommendation processes. And as you can see, they come from a wide variety of sectors and fields. And it'll also depend who's available in that region where the team is located. So it's very important that these team members, are very aware of the field of FASD and are experts in that field to make an appropriate assessment and contribute to the recommendation process. And even though they may have their own specific role, it's very important that they are knowledgeable about the whole process itself, because often interacting with the client and the family, you do want to provide that explanation. When deliberations do take place, it's important that all team members participate. And these discussions are thoughtful, broad-ranging, and patient and family-centered. Discussions should also be robust and they should be open. Everyone should feel safe in speaking their mind, discussing various aspects, and each team member should provide respect for others and their expertise. Recommendations should be evidence-based whenever possible. The team dynamics should be such that it is an opportunity to share knowledge, educate one another around FASD plus other aspects of whether it's diagnosis or recommendations, or even data collection, as Coleen has alluded to. What about the team process itself? How well is it working? Are there things that we can improve and do better? And what has worked well, and continue to do those things? And those deliberations are significant and important. So the diagnostic process itself should confirm the prenatal alcohol use, and one has to ascertain that this was in amounts that was sufficient to cause the neurobehavioral issues that we are seeing. And a lot of information collection that takes place, as Coleen mentioned, around the social history, the medical history, looking at past developmental milestones and educational performance. An interview is conducted usually by the physician, nurse practitioner, with sometimes a psychologist or even the coordinator playing a role there. And that looks at other FASD associated behaviors. And then that physical assessment, looking at a physical exam, a neurological exam, measuring the facial features, keeping in mind always a differential diagnosis and noting down any minor or major congenital anomalies. And then obviously, you know, the clinicians will do that comprehensive assessment of the various brain domains, which I'll be coming to. It's important that certainly the physician, because this is a medical diagnosis, be very tuned to the diagnostic guideline and be aware when to use that clinical judgment, because just because certain domains are impaired and you have the diagnostic criteria doesn't mean you all have always got that diagnosis. Or can be the other way too. Yeah, you haven't quite met the criteria. Is it still suggestive that alcohol played a significant role? It's important that the physician or the nurse practitioner is available, is knowledgeable about what other tests, what tests the other clinicians are using, what domains they're assessing, and you know, be aware of the formulation, diagnosis, and recommendations, and make a contribution to that. And then speaking with the client and the family and disclosing the assessment results and the recommendations. You know, the clinical presentation of FASD is very complex due to the interaction between pre and postnatal environmental factors, the stresses, other substances besides alcohol. Subsequently, what opportunities have been available, what are the exposures that have been, genetics and environmental factors play a significant role. And so this creates that unique person who with behavioral and other challenges, but also that resiliency piece. So when we're looking at PAE determination, which Coleen addressed, we want to make sure that we are looking at the index pregnancy. We also want to look at the sources that we've accessed to confirm this are reliable and devoid of any conflict of interest. Just because there has been previous history of substance use, lifestyle challenges, unsubstantiated information, or if there's been other children who've been diagnosed with FASD, does not necessarily confirm that there was alcohol consumption during this index pregnancy. So one has to be very careful, and that information is collected in a very sensitive fashion. And one wants to look at all the details around that consumption of beverages during the pregnancy, what types, frequency, timing, the duration, and the pattern. We know that even a single episode of binge drinking does have measurable neurobehavioral effects. And we also are aware that exposure to alcohol early in pregnancy, before the awareness of the pregnancy, can have physical and neurobehavioral challenges. So what we are looking for is that threshold where we are confident that alcohol did have a significant role in terms of making that neurobehavioral impact. And we're looking at 7 or more standard drinks per week, or any episode where there's at least 4 drinks per occasion. And we know that yes, there is an impact related to a single binge, but that effect may be a little bit on the smaller side. So we do ensure that the threshold that we have is at least 2 binges, and these 2 binges can occur at any time during the pregnancy. We do look at the sentinel facial features. Obviously, one looks at the gestalt, but we know that there are 3 facial features that are specific for prenatal alcohol exposure. And those are the palpebral fissure length, the icelet, the philtrum, which is the groove between the nose and the upper lip, and the upper lip itself. Certainly looking at the philtrum and the upper lip, it can be quite subjective, so individuals may not agree. So that's why the University of Washington developed a lip philtrum guide, which I'll show you in the next slide, to look at how to objectively evaluate that lip and philtrum. The measurement of the palpebral fissures takes a little bit of practice and really requires training to do those measurements. So here the 2 pictures, A and C, do show you the broad range. The philtrum, that's the groove between the nose and the upper lip, shows on that A picture that's a nice deep groove with good pillars. And if you look at the one on the C, that's quite flat and it's effaced. There isn't any. Similarly, if you look at the upper lip, in the depiction in A, the picture A, you see a full upper lip, whereas in C is a thin upper lip. And just the bottom 2 pictures just represent what happens to that philtrum and that upper lip, especially in picture B, when you have a smile. So we do recommend a passport style photo, right? No smiles. If you look at the lip philtrum guide on the right, it just shows that range of 1 to 5, with 4 and 5 being significant. And obviously we look for the lip separately and the philtrum separately. That shows us, that provides much more objective evidence of the measurements. When we're looking at isolate measurements, you can see what portions and the landmarks here that are included in those measurements. So when we do say that there are sentinel facial features present, what we are saying is that the islets, so the palpebral fissure length, is significantly small, so below the 3rd percentile, and the lip and the philtrum have received a score of 4 or 5. And these 3 features have to be present simultaneously before we can say that sentinel facial features are present, meaning that you can't take one, say the philtrum, which is 4 or 5 at one occasion, and then measure palpebral fissures on another occasion and say, oh yeah, they're below the 3rd percentile at that time. There is a facial photographic software which was developed by the University of Washington. This can be used after having taken a photograph and doing the measurements. However, one needs to have good knowledge regarding this software and appropriate training before using it. So the next big area is brain dysfunction. Here, just to remember that neurodevelopmental deficits are complex and multifaceted, and they occur regardless of facial findings. In fact, I'd say only 10% of the children and adults we see have the facial findings. There isn't a single neuropsychological measure, nor a profile that fits all the individuals that we see who have a diagnosis of FASD. Obviously, there are multiple factors that can impact what we are seeing in that individual that may explain the variability of presentations that we see. Certainly, the common areas of disability we see are related to attention, executive functioning, spatial working memory, learning deficits, communication, and adaptive behavior. So one of the very significant impacts of this guideline was to make sure that what we were assessing was more standardized rather than that variability of subjective processes by clinicians. So wherever possible, direct standardized measures are used to assess those brain domains. Certainly, there will be times when we will need to use questionnaires and clinical interviews or file reviews. These are indirect measures, and we want to ensure that those indirect measures are significant. So we would look at multiple sources for that, and we would also ensure that when those indirect assessments are being interpreted, they are at a severity level below the 3rd percentile. And here, this is a depiction of the 10 brain domains that are looked at. We are looking at an extreme clinical cutoff of at least 2 standard deviations below the mean, once again, below the 3rd percentile. And that's to ensure that, there's certainty that alcohol played a crucial role here. As I look at the prenatal and postnatal factors later on, you'll see that there are so many other factors that could be contributing. So it's important that here the team plays that critical role in making that assessment of those brain domains and interpreting the results and making that diagnosis. And it's important to remember this diagnostic profile is dynamic and may change over time. And often we have clients that have several assessments over a lifespan. So when do we make that diagnosis? We want to look at least 3 domains that are significantly impaired to indicate severe and pervasive brain dysfunction. One domain that I did really want to briefly address was this affect regulation. This is a little bit different in our guideline because survey evidence did show that there is high prevalence of anxiety and depression amongst the FASD population, and subsequent research has shown that that the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure is direct rather than secondary as we previously believed. That's why we included affect regulation. And what we're looking for here is a long-standing problem of dysregulation rather than just one that's occurred as a result of a short-term response to some unfavorable life event or circumstance. And we do want to satisfy the DSM-5 criteria when we do make that diagnosis. Now, just to touch on the diagnostic categories that we have. We've simplified the process of this being an FASD diagnosis. So FASD previously used to be used as an umbrella term. Now this is specific. It's an FASD diagnosis with either the facial features or without the facial features. Coleen alluded to designation. Basically what we're saying here is that, yes, we did confirm prenatal alcohol exposure, but at this moment in time, we couldn't make that diagnosis. So this patient is at risk of developing or having a neurodevelopmental disorder and diagnosis of FASD later on, but we cannot make that diagnosis. So we've said that this is a designation for now. And there will be some clients who won't have an FASD diagnosis despite having prenatal alcohol exposure. And we do say that they do not have FASD in that case. So once again, there's FASD with sentinel facial features. So you have the simultaneous presentation of the 3 sentinel facial features. Do those assessments, there's impairment in 3 or more CNS domains. There's one exception. In infants and young children, if we see microcephaly, we will say that infant can receive a diagnosis of FASD with sentinel facial features. But I'll come back to that. There's some caution attached to that process. In this category of diagnosis, we want to remember that PAE can be confirmed or it can be unknown. But obviously, if there is any confirmation that there was no PAE, so if a mom says she did not drink during pregnancy, we wouldn't make the diagnosis. And then the other area is FASD without the sentinel facial features. Obviously, here we have criteria as far as brain dysfunction is concerned, but we do not have the facial features, and we have confirmed PAE. I've already mentioned that the designation of at risk for neurodevelopmental disorder and FASD. Here, we do not meet the criteria for the brain domains being impaired, and there is confirmation of PAE. And we do need to provide that explanation of why we couldn't reach that. Sometimes, as Coleen mentioned, that the child may be young. Sometimes an adult client may not be able to complete the assessment. There may be other circumstances of, mental impairment due to either mental health disorder or substance use that one did not feel comfortable. I had a patient not too long ago where the patient had a medical condition of thyrotoxicosis and had challenges related to mental health, memory, anxiety that I could not complete and did not proceed with this. So yes, even though there was confirmed PAE. So, what we're saying basically that this individual may have FASD, which may be diagnosed later on, but we cannot do so at this time. We must do an assessment later on. And wherever possible, we do try and provide supports for these individuals as if they've received a diagnosis of FASD. So we do provide education and supports. As I mentioned earlier, if they do not meet that criteria, subsequently, when proper assessment can be completed, then we say that, yes, they may not have that FASD diagnosis. So looking at diagnosis in infants and young children, yes, there are measures available which vary in depth, breadth and reliability in terms of their psychometric measures. And yes, some children will meet that criteria. One of the things we do struggle with is infants and young children may have delays that could get better with some intervention. We are a little bit cautious saying this is a disorder which is going to be a lifetime, which may have lifetime impact. We also want to be cautious around this microcephaly. We know that children who have that small head size will have significant findings when we do their brain domain assessments at a later on. And this is what we do recommend, that they do have that complete assessment. But we want to look at that differential diagnosis to make sure that we don't have an overlap or another condition contributing to what we are seeing. And those children who have all those sentinel facial features should be evaluated a little bit more in depth, looking at the sentinel facial feature, at genetics and genetic testing. So I have a brief picture of this algorithm that we use and clinics can use to take us down this cascade of whether we have a diagnosis or not. Just briefly, a caution around diagnosis, look at other overlapping diagnoses and look at other genetic causes. If there's any significant brain injury, which may be contributing, you want to make sure that you address those issues. Looking at prenatal and postnatal factors, which may add complexity to the picture that we are seeing. There may be medical conditions, other medications, over-the-counter preparations, other substance use. There are prenatal factors, genetic causes. And, postnatally, if there's trauma can be a significant contributor to what we are seeing, along with neglect. And many of our individuals may have moved from place to place. Prenatal exposures do contribute to externalizing behaviors and mental health problems. Prenatal stress can result in negative behavioral outcomes, and postnatal adversities can have a cumulative effect on language, attention, memory, intelligence, and behavior. So yeah, we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
And just FYI, we do have our national database that many of you are participating in. So thank you for that. And we are starting to see some really interesting, I guess, trajectories of sensory issues and when they sort of emerge, and also some sex differences. And so as we get more and more information, we're able to actually use those criteria or those additional factors and see how they actually may predict FASD. And so are they really sensitive to prenatal alcohol exposure, and are they reliable enough that they actually are a predictive or a criteria that should be considered in the diagnosis. And so again, we're always using evidence and using information to be able to think about how we can make the diagnostic process more refined, more specific. Maybe we only have to measure 2 things instead of, a whole bunch of things. And so only when we get the information about our population of individuals with FASD, where we know prenatal alcohol exposure has played a big factor in their brain and behavior, then we can go back and start to refine things. And so to Dr. Rajani's point, now we're capturing all this information that we think is really critical, and we have enough numbers, or starting to have enough power in our database that we can answer some of these questions and put together maybe another menu of diagnosis, and that's even more specific and sensitive. And so that, I think, is really exciting. So I think that we will wrap up for today because it's Friday, and thank you everybody for coming. Still so many people, and we will for sure, your questions will get answered. So that's good. The YouTube link is going to be sent where the recording is. And so a big thank you to Coleen and to Dr. Rajani. There's another webinar that CanFASD is having on March 4th, and it's going to be a great one because the recipients of the Dr. Sterling Claren Research Award will be introduced, and they're going to present their work, which is incredibly exciting. And I'm sure that Sterling might actually make a cameo appearance. And so that's also pretty spectacular because he's done so much incredible work in the field, and it's always exciting to listen to him as well. And so just check out CanFASD's website at www.canfasd.ca. And you can also follow them on their social media channels to look at their resources. And I actually put a few links to some papers that they've developed that sort of summarizes some of the evidence in those hot areas in the chat. So thanks everybody for being here. It was great to not really get to see you, but to get to see your names and imagine that everybody's having a great hair day. And I'm happy that everybody's safe and well. So thanks everybody. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to CanFASD, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.